Okay, welcome everybody. So the purpose of today's training is to discuss shared living, residential habilitation, and the process that will be implemented April 1st, moving forward on how people access that service. And so we're going to go through two documents. One will be kind of a 3-page guide that is not exhaustive by any means, because we know that each person's supported needs are a little different and every family's needs look a little different. And so sometimes, the timelines or those kinds of things can vary a bit, but it will give a general process on what the steps will be to allow someone to access and authorize shared living. The second document that we will review is the DHS DD 850, which is a document that exists and has been revised to reflect the new needs in terms of the new process. And so we'll start out with that. But before we get into the specifics of the new process, I kind of want to just give a little bit of an overview of where we've come from and where we're going. And so historically, prior to the updated waiver in 2023, June 1st, 2023, shared living was considered a residential option within the choices waiver. However, the level of care that it provided was essentially 24/7 level of care. And so effective June 1st, what we did was build in a tiered system to allow people across the spectrum of support needs to access residential habilitation through shared living. And so with that came a need to update our process, and a work group was formed that included family support coordinators, case managers, and CSP representatives to kind of develop this new process. Now, it's been a bit of time since that work group met and developed this process, just because, as we all know, our system has undergone quite a few changes, big changes, and we had kind of collectively determined that while important, this was something that, we had an established process, people were able to access the service. And so we waited a little bit on this change just to ensure that we could systematically have some time to adjust to all of the other great and big initiatives that we had taken on. And so we're at a point where we're going to implement this change. But just rest assured, I'm not going anywhere. And so while we will implement this new process on April 1st, I will still be available to, kind of help with that transition. And also just myself and any representative of DDD is available to answer any questions that you may have as we adjust to this new process. And so I just kind of want to make sure, put anybody's mind at ease that feels like another change is coming. But we're definitely going to all work through it together. And so another kind of where we've been versus where we're going is it's a little bit of a mindset change in terms of adjusting to this new process. As historically, there was kind of a pre-approval aspect to accessing shared living. So the DD 850 effectively served to what was kind of commonly known as, a shared living request or application for that service is, I think, how most people in our system understand it. And so essentially that was the very first step, was to complete that DD 850, submit it to the division, and receive a shared living approval letter. And then that kind of initiated the rest of accessing shared living services. And so I think that probably the biggest change will be that effectively, instead of, it's a mindset shift and a language shift in terms of that is no longer an application, it's supporting documentation. So similarly across our system, for example, assistive technology, if someone's trying to access assistive technology, there's supporting documentation required and submitted along with that SCR. And so that's what the DD 850 is becoming. And so we're going to all work together and kind of make it through this mindset shift. But really accessing shared living will be, follow the same process as the other services that are available on the choices waiver. and we'll walk through that process now. But I just kind of wanted to give that heads up that it's going to be a little bit of it's going to feel like we're reversing that process in terms of at what point you're contacting essentially the division or your CSS staff to open that service. So we'll just get right into it, and feel free to put any questions in the chat along the way. I'm going to share my screen, and the way, as you'll see, the way that it's broken up is to kind of 3 different scenarios, I would say, in terms of what we generally see or typically see when someone's accessing services in South Dakota. And so the 3 different stages that we're going to talk about is a new application for choices. So someone who's not currently receiving either waiver service. So a new applicant to choices. The second process we'll talk about is someone who is currently receiving choices waiver services and is looking to add shared living. And then the third scenario we'll talk about is someone who is currently receiving Family Support 360 services and what it looks like to transfer to the choices waiver. So in general, as we talk about the process for each of these things, if you have questions about kind of one of those other scenarios, we'll try and save that for when we're specifically talking about that process, but I'm happy to hear any and all questions. But give me 1 minute because I don't think I can see the chat box with my screen being shared as it is.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and monitor the chat box
Okay.
for you.
Lovely. Thank you, Katie. Okay, so shared living residential habilitation. This will be a document that will be available to everyone following this training, and then it will be also posted on the DHS website in the provider portal for your review as well. So this is a new document, was created specifically to talk about this new process. So as you'll see in this introduction, this is the language specifically pulled from the waiver as it's written, and it just explains that shared living is an arrangement of services provided to a participant in the private home of a community member or friend, and then kind of goes into what shared living services are and how they're provided. So we're going to move into a process for a new applicant who's applying to receive choices waiver and shared living services. And just an FYI, if for those of you that are going to be accessing this form digitally, each of these blue underlined items will be a link to that resource. So if you click on this link to the guide, it'll take you to the DHS website where the application guide for services is housed. So hopefully this will be a good resource for you to be able to access any other resources in this process that you may need to be able to utilize this service. So starting from the beginning of this process, so any individual who has not received choices waiver services in the past 90 days. So it doesn't necessarily mean they've never received waiver services, but don't have any current active authorized waiver services. They will follow the application process outlined in the application guide for services. So their first contact, as always, to receive services in South Dakota will be through the front door, through DHS intake, which is the Dakota at Home option 2. And that's all outlined in this application guide for services on the website. And then if they're found eligible for choices, then the individual will be referred to a conflict-free case management provider. Once they've selected the provider that best meets their needs, then their case manager will begin the individualized service planning or ISP process to help identify those services and supports needed. So that is a step that happens regardless of accessing shared living or not. That's just the front door and the beginning of utilizing choices services in South Dakota. So then how specific to shared living, if those residential supports are identified, it's identified that shared living is going to meet their needs and those residential goals, then the case manager will facilitate applications to community support providers who provide the service. There are currently 8 of them in the state. And so kind of as one big update to our the updated information on the website, which will include the resources that we go over today, the video of this training today, and then we'll also have an updated list with contact information and the area served of each of those 8 community support providers that offer shared living. And so based on the admissions decisions of those CSPs, once the individual selects their preferred provider, then the matching process will occur. And that process is outlined in the shared living guide. And so again, we have a link to that guide, and you'll be able to access that if you're using this application electronically. And so once that matching process is completed, then a shared living provider is identified, and then they'll receive their training. So again, this process is, we're looking at flipping it a little bit, right? Historically, we've had all of the approval and all of that completed before we're looking at the training. And this is essentially establishing that, the training begins happening. And then as you'll see here, that family members, if a family member is identified as the shared living provider, then there are additional training modules that will be located on the DDD website. And so this is a requirement that is currently suspended, as these modules have not been available on our website for some time, as those of you who are familiar with this process are aware. But we're very close. We've got the link, and so now it's just a matter of getting them accessible on the website. And so there will also be mass communication when that is available and ready. And it's not only a good resource for family members who are actively training to become shared living providers, but they're also an excellent resource and can be used as kind of a just informational tool for families who are maybe curious about shared living, but aren't necessarily ready to begin that process. So as I said, there will be more updates to come, but I wanted to make sure to include it in this process because it will be there soon and very soon. So if the shared living provider is a non-family member, an HCBS settings assessment will be completed prior to residential services beginning. And so this is a process that, because the community support provider is essentially establishing a new setting, a new shared living setting, then the community support provider will work in conjunction with their community support specialist, their CSS that they work with, that's kind of their identified state liaison, to establish that setting. And so that's a process that's part of this, but that has been identified separate from this. So you can always reach out to your individual CSS if you have questions about how that process works. But this piece is coordinated between the CSP and their community support specialist. So then if the shared living provider is a family member, then the CSP does still inform the assigned community support provider of the new location prior to services beginning. So if it's a non-family member as the SLP, that HCBS settings assessment will be completed. But either way, the community support provider will be communicating to establish that new setting so that it's available in IRIS when the SCR is submitted to open those services. So then, so once these things have happened, all of this is happening in conjunction with identifying a start date, right? And so when this initial communication is happening with the community support provider and it is chosen, you'll have a general idea of how long will it take to train providers, what kind of timeline are we looking at in terms of what training needs to occur, getting the assessments completed to be able to start the shared living services. And so once that has been identified, then the case manager will complete either an initial and annual authorization or a service change request requesting the pre-authorization for the shared living services. And so this kind of identifies if that has happened, if you come into the eligibility process knowing we've got our provider identified, we're ready to go, then it's very possible that within the first 30 days, all of those necessary steps have been completed and shared living can be authorized as a part of that initial and annual or the PPOC as part of the level of care process. However, if a provider has not been identified or it's beyond that 30 days when the initial ISP is completed, then and that initial and annual authorization has already been started. So say somebody coming onto Choices is going to start with day services or employment services. Those can begin, and then an SCR would be submitted via IRIS to add shared living residential services. So I hope that was clear on which option you would choose. But regardless, whether it's an initial authorization or a service change request, both of those documents require this DHS DD 850 to be completed and submitted as supplementary documentation, right? And so just like any other service, if we have an identified need, again, similar to assistive technology or medical equipment and drugs, we would expect to see that documentation to, support and identify that that has taken place. And so as we'll go through the DD 850, but it's essentially the documentation supporting the need for shared living to be opened. And then an updated ISP indicating that shared living meets the individual's residential support needs. And so if that's been decided in that initial ISP, then we would be able to see that, which is currently in TheraP, but eventually we'll move into the documentation stored within IRIS. So then when shared living has been authorized through that initial authorization or that SCR, the case manager will receive notification of approval and services may begin. And that will be authorized on the start date that was identified with the case manager and the community support provider. So that is what the process will look like, again, for a new applicant for Choices or someone who has not been receiving waiver services historically. So I do want to just pause now and answer any questions that we have about this part of the process. Okay, I'm not hearing any, and I do seem to have lost my chat box. So I'm trusting that we don't have any questions and I'll move forward.
Nope, there are no questions in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Where in this process that you've talked about so far, does the family do what's required to be the shared living provider, like the med training and stuff?
So this is at step number 3. So once they've gotten attached to a conflict-free case manager, they have facilitated those communications with the community support provider, and then they will receive training in accordance with ARSD 460401. So that's when all of that training will take place at that point in time, in addition to the modules and the settings assessments.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so we will move on.
1 second, Gus, just to clarify on her question. So that would be before either the annual authorization request was submitted with the start date or via the SCR. You can't put a date and then do the training after that date's been. They have to be ready to actually provide the service.
Yes, you
for
can
a start date.
Yeah, you can identify a future start date given that it provides the appropriate amount of time for that training to take place before the start date. But the services, the start date authorized in either the initial authorization or the SCR, it would be the expectation that all required training is completed by that start date time. Okay. So we're gonna move on. Oh, yeah.
So there is one more question. Susan? Sue? You have your hand raised. Do you have a question?
Oh, Shauna? Yeah, sorry.
Oh.
Shauna,
How
sorry.
long does, like, that's okay. I should probably have my first name. So how long does the training take? Like, is it kind of depend on based on availability to get Medi-Aid trained, CPR trained? I mean, is it a guarantee like, hey, you could have this all done within 6 weeks, 4 weeks, 3 weeks? Like, what's the process behind all of this?
So that will depend on the CSP process of their choosing. Essentially, the shared living provider is becoming a contracted employee of that CSP. And so therefore they would, follow the process designated by that CSP. And so I don't necessarily have like a time frame specifically that I can give you. Any CSPs that are on the line, you can certainly speak up, but that would be very clearly identified and communicated on like in step 1. When you're facilitating those conversations, then the community support provider would essentially establish that timeline right off the bat of this is about how long our process would take for training, depending on the availability of the shared living provider, because some people have more availability to get it all done right away. And some people, depending on life circumstances, it might just take a little longer.
So when someone's transferring from family support over to shared living, is there a gap within who should be doing this and this versus who shouldn't be?
We'll talk about that when we get to that section.
Okay.
But just to avoid confusion, I'm going to kind of keep them sectioned to the scenarios that we're talking about. So we'll definitely address your question, John.
And we have a couple questions in the chat now. The first, can you share what the training looks like and how a provider accesses that?
So again, that training, I could pull up ARSD, but that training is outlined in rule, and as they become a contracted provider, that training is to some extent determined by the agency that they choose to contract with. And so there's some rule training specified, such as the pre-hire screening background checks. There's some pre-screening options that they have to do. So we can definitely, this rule I could link in this form so you can see those, but how they access it is dependent on the community support provider that they opt to go with. Which again, all of that will be communicated and established to them in the beginning process of accessing the service.
Okay, next question. So is the CSP providing training and services without being paid?
So it'll be kind of in conjunction with when this is happening. So they'll be receiving some case management and they'll be starting that training in conjunction with when the start date is identified.
So I was just going to ask Shirley, so when you hire a new DSP and they're not working directly with participants, you're not necessarily, the funding that you're receiving for the people you already support isn't necessarily going, like paying that DSP's wages. I would sort of equate it to that, I suppose.
I'm just thinking of if the family wants to be the shared living provider and, we can't start choices until they've had all the training they need. So basically, we're going to be working with a new family and providing training and screenings and everything because we can't do the start date until they're ready to go.
Right.
Yeah, it doesn't seem quite right.
As Julie mentioned, it mimics, it is an employee, a contracted employee. So the participant can be receiving services during that time, such as day service.
No, they are independent contractors. They are not agency employees.
Right. Correct. Is there further clarification that's needed on that?
And then Regan just posted, Regan Moses from Lifescape just posted kind of a little bit about the process that they use. They have an informational meeting prior to the host home provider application for the CSP. They discuss the timelines, layout, training expectations for their CSP, and state that it takes anywhere from about 4 to 6 weeks, depending on how quickly a host home provider can get their trainings completed. Thank you, Regan. That is very helpful information. And then Chad, when do these changes go into effect? I believe April 1st is what Gus said. That there are no more questions in the chat.
So we will continue with a participant. Oh, there we go. I'm gonna move this over here. So we will continue with a participant who is currently receiving Choices Waiver Services and is looking to add or change their residential services to include shared living. And so as we go through this process, a lot of the process mimics each other, right? It's not a whole brand new process for each step, but we just wanted to kind of identify, because a lot of those kind of beginning systems will change depending on what the starting point is. So when an individual is already receiving Choices services and is considering adding or changing residential services, the ISP team will meet to identify supports needed and when there's a change in those supports. So of course, that's already something that exists within our system. If someone's services or support needs have changed, the ISP team would meet to identify what those changes are. And then if shared living supports are identified with that team, then the case manager, who exists because they're currently receiving Choices Waiver Services, would facilitate the applications to the community support providers. And again, based on those decisions, the individual would select their preferred provider and the matching process would occur. And so again, at that point, when the match has been made, then that's when we would essentially move forward with receiving the training and establishing all of those things that are necessary. And so again, the modules, if it's a family member, if it's a non-family member, we would look at establishing that HCBS settings assessment. And so that would include a home visit with your community support specialist or another identified member of the DD team. And then the CSP would be communicating that new setting to their community support specialist. So this process looks the same at that point, that as soon as a start date has been identified, the case manager will complete a service change request and submit it to DDD to authorize those services that will support them as identified in their ISP. So as it's mentioned here, the case manager does not necessarily have to wait, as we said earlier, until the shared living provider has received all of their training to submit that SCR, as long as the authorized start date allows the amount of time that will be necessary for the training to be completed prior to those services. And so that can be determined by, open and consistent communication between the case manager and the CSP on what time will be allotted for that to take place. Then again, the SCR to add, this needs to be capital, shared living residential services will require that DDD or the DHS DD 850 to be completed and uploaded to the FTP site, submitted with that authorization request. And then when it's been authorized and they receive notification, then those services and can be billed for, essentially effective with the start date that's been determined. So I do see a couple of.
Yep. So the first one was from Kristen Klein at CFI, just explaining their process similar to Regan. Thank you, Kristen, for sharing that. They offer independent contractors to attend their agency trainings that they have happening for their other new employees free of charge. And they also offer them the opportunity to complete training on their learning management system at their own costs. And then, of course, they assist in the med administration as it requires med passes to become certified. So thank you, Kristen, for sharing that, and also Regan. And then Chad was wondering about how long it will take how long the DDD trainings for family members take, and would that be in addition to the CSP training time period?
So those modules are available online and can be done virtually on their own timing. But yes, essentially completing those training modules would be in addition, that would be expected to be completed prior to services start. And since we just recently got the links, I would have to double check. From what I recall, the last time that I went through those modules, it's no more than I think an hour cumulatively to complete those modules, but I can certainly follow up on that and maybe put that information alongside them on the website. Yes. Okay. Seeing no further questions, again, these processes all mirror each other because once we get kind of into it, the process is the same. And I think probably where there's the most what we would say like overlap or potentially some confusion is when we look at individuals moving from Family Support 360 to the Choices Waiver to ensure that there's no gap in services while those are happening. And so I think I'll just start out by saying that just knowing how this has worked historically for the entirety of shared living being offered in our state, I don't know that we've come to kind of the perfect transition point in family support just based on, again, the training needs and the family's individual support needs. And so while this lays out the process of how it will look, I will say that this is not exhaustive and that I think we will certainly see some families who have kind of outstanding needs in this area. And so we're definitely committed. And I think that's where transitioning from the applications or this DD 850 coming to myself every time, it will now be being reviewed by your community support specialist. And so that gives us a lot more flexibility to work with the agency and the family support coordinator and to really determine and work with them to identify how to make that transition as smooth as possible. And so I think that it will be a little bit more targeted TA with someone who is working directly with you on a consistent basis. So we're going to kind of get into the process. I'm sure we'll have some questions come up as we go through it, and we'll work through them. And that is to say this process was developed by that work group in what we thought was the best. And we're certainly open to, once we've implemented and know how it's going and kind of see how it's operating in real time, we can certainly adjust any pieces of this as we see is necessary. So when an individual is receiving Family Support 360 waiver services and they indicate interest in residential services, their first point of contact is always going to be the family support coordinator, who's going to provide the education and resources regarding the service options that may meet the person's needs. And so this, includes a lot of, because the waivers and the services that they offer are different. So that will be a big part of that education and resource piece in allowing families to understand the differences between what the services offer. And then if they identify that it will meet their needs to move to the Choices Waiver to include shared living as a residential option, then the family support coordinator will be the one that facilitates that communication and applications with the community support providers who will provide the service. And so at that time, they will kind of be that touch point to facilitate that communication. And that's where kind of establishing those timelines and what the expectations for training will be ahead of time to know and to be able to work really collaboratively to determine that start date. So there's not a gap in those services. And so if it's determined, that it'll take X amount of time, then we'll, maybe we'll hold off on that piece. And in addition, so when they're looking to opt for the choices waiver, regardless, they will be again accessing the front door through DDD intake through that Dakota at Home option 2 number. And the intake worker will be kind of a second point of reference in identifying, kind of where they're at. If it's a family member or a family who has identified shared living as a residential service would meet their needs, but don't have a provider identified, then maybe that would be where it's the team and the intake worker could help communicate. Maybe we go back to step 2 before we initiate that level of care process, because if we initiate the level of care and find eligibility and they transfer to the choices waiver and don't have a provider identified, there could be a gap in residential services, not to say that they couldn't be accessing any other of the choices waiver services in the meantime. So that's where I think that team approach and that targeted working with kind of all of the players will help to determine what the appropriate transition time looks like. But we've gotten to this point. It's been determined that they will do a referral to Dakota at Home. Eligibility documents may need to be updated or gathered. And then once an individual is determined eligible for choices, they'll be referred to and select a case management provider. So at this point, it's considered best practice to have a transition meeting facilitated by the family support coordinator to introduce the choices case manager and to kind of clarify roles and expectations moving forward of just what that handoff is we've completed A, B, and C, and moving forward, the case manager will be responsible for D, E, and F. Just because I know that has been historically something that's been a little bit tricky, but that's why we suggest this transition meeting so that everyone's very clear about what their role is. So then based on the CSP admissions decisions, they'll be selecting their preferred provider, again, following through with the matching and training requirements that have been outlined at each step of the way. None of that changes. And then an identified start date has been given. And so this mimics the first process where if this has all happened within the first 30 days, and then they would do an initial authorization to authorize shared living services, or if maybe, as I said in that first example of someone has opted to start choices services, maybe receiving day services and employment supports, right? So then they would do an SCR to open shared living if that happens secondary in the process. And so the requirements are the same. Again, the initial authorization would be used within the first 30 days, and the service change request would be if that has already been submitted. The DD 850 would still be completed and attached, along with the ISP indicating that need. And then here's just to say, as I've said, but to reiterate in the process that an individual may choose to transfer to choices waiver prior to shared living provider being identified. If they're looking for a community provider and one has not been identified, but it's been identified that other choices services will be able to meet their needs, then in that instance, the step 2 would occur after step 5. So the coordinating supports, or I guess the family support coordinator would not be the one facilitating, but the applications to community support providers would essentially occur after step 5, if that makes sense. Okay, Chad, I do see a question.
Yeah, we have a couple others
Yeah.
before that though. So it would be nice when transitioning to get the paperwork like the ISP, etc. Instead of starting over. It also gives more information when learning the new file that is around the transition from family support to choices.
Yeah, and can be communicated and provided during that transition.
Thank you. Does a person have to be off of school funding? So they have to be January 30th after their 21st birthday, before they are eligible for shared living.
So an individual needs to be 21 to be able to receive Choices waiver services. So if they opt to do that, like within, so say they turn 21 January 1st, they would not have to wait till after June 30th to opt into those services. If that makes sense.
So it doesn't have to follow the kids turning 21 as long as they're 21.
But
Well,
Gus, in that instance, wouldn't the school have to agree to pay? The school would have to agree to pay part of the tuition and the residential matching funds.
yes, that
That's
is. So they can opt in as long as they have the school on board. However, if the school is not on board, then yes, it is true that it would have to be after June 30th when they were no longer on school funding to access shared living. Thanks for that clarification.
I'm just curious, extending onto that question. So like somebody's 21 in March and then the school funding doesn't end till June 30th. Can they start applying for the shared living process and just not have that start date until after July? Can they start that early, like 3 or 4 months early?
That would be appropriate to start communicating with community support providers, just to identify, those that they would be willing to work with. And then to have a start date after June 30th. Yes. Historically, we've kind of encouraged families to start that process a little bit early for that buffer time.
Thank you.
So case management agencies will be sending out a referral to all CSPs that provide the type of service the person is seeking. Yes or no?
Correct. Yes, they would
Okay.
facilitate, or the family support coordinator, in this case, would facilitate those applications to those 8 community support providers currently.
So back to the transition. So yes, Rhonda, you are accurate that they are different forms and they're not accessible in there by the case manager. So again, you'd just request that during that transition meeting time to get a copy of that. Keep in mind though that you would still need to do a new ISP, as the services that a person receives in family support are different than the services that a person would receive in Choices. They're 2 different waivers. So and having to start over and do a new ISP would be a requirement.
Mhm.
Okay. An issue we keep seeing pop up is intake specialists and the case managers set up a start date with the family, but do not include the family support coordinator, and the family support coordinator is told of the discharge after the discharge date. Just reminding to keep the family support coordinator in the loop of the eligibility process. Thank you. Thank you, Jessica.
Yes, correct. I think we've learned from a couple of instances of that. And so to keep that communication open is very important. Yes, Jessica.
And then the next one is just that, yes, the school district would need to be in agreement to pay that. So yes, thank you everybody for your comments and your questions.
Okay, so I do want to be sensitive to time, and so you can continue to put questions in the chat box, and we can develop kind of an FAQ around this process as well. But I want to make sure that we can address the DD 850 as well. So the DD 850 will look pretty familiar. It's essentially just been a revised document to the one that existed prior, to ensure that all of the pieces are on here. And so, as I said, so this is a supplementary document for the SCR to open shared living services as an authorization. And part of the supplementary piece of this and the purpose that it serves is that all shared living settings are required to be fully compliant with the HCBS settings rule prior to the delivery of services in that setting. And so as we know that individuals who are the shared living provider that has been identified, if they are a family member, those settings are presumed to be in compliance. And this is just a document that's a tool and a resource to families and the coordinators and case managers to ensure that all of those targeted areas have been identified. And so I'm going to kind of just not read through each and every one of these, as you can see on here, but it's identifying information, right? And so what we're going to identify is all of this identifying information about the participant that will be receiving services. The reason that we have the current representative payee on here is because, as you know, per ARSD, the shared living provider cannot also be the representative payee. And so that's on here just to establish that the provider and the rep payee are not the same individual. And that process has been completed. And then again, this family member, whether it's a family member or community member, which then kind of goes into, has the CSP worked with their assigned CSS to establish the new shared living settings. And so this is just kind of identifying that all of those pieces have been completed. And I do see John questioning when the modules will be online, as that's indicated on here. And that will be communicated very soon. They're not currently available. And so as we've operated historically up until this point, that requirement has essentially been suspended. And so anyone who's trying to access shared living at the moment, or kind of who is already in the process, will not be expected to complete those modules prior to being able to receive the service. We don't want that to be a barrier. And then once they are available, there will be kind of communication about what that transition will look like and how that will be.
So Gus, should that be clarified that it's only the family member shared living providers that need to complete that?
Yeah. So that, I mean, that's in the shared living guide, but you're saying clarified on this form if it's a family member?
Well, I was wondering if it should specify that, or is there an N? I suppose you could just type in not applicable because it's a non-family member.
Yeah.
Okay.
But because I think historically we've had if the family member is a shared living provider. So that's a good note.
Yeah.
We can keep that up.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. And then Terry's asking if the participants on family support moving to shared living who completes the DD-850 form. So it'll be the case manager's responsibility to submit that, as that process will happen once they're receiving choices services and have been identified to a case manager. But that's not to say that the family support coordinator cannot have a role in kind of gathering that information, as they are, you know, the kind of the historian of that that participant up until that point. That certainly can be, any of that information can be communicated from this family support coordinator to the case manager, but the case manager holds the ultimate responsibility of completing that and submitting it. And then yes, a guardian that's in the home that's not the shared living provider can be the rep payee. Do you recommend a family support coordinator complete a new ICAP? And so kind of as we've said, since a new ISP will be completed, that kind of would be the expectation that that ICAP would be updated during that process to meet the new ICAP expectations.
Would that ICAP be completed then by the family support coordinator, or would it be completed by the choice side?
I think that can be determined during that transition. Okay, so again, all of this identifying information is there to ensure that the pieces that need to be in effect are in effect. And then moving into these, the life domains. So this is a tool from Charting the Life course that is kind of effectively just identifying. And so this is the tool that you would essentially document when the ISP team is gathering to identify what the support needs and how shared living meets those support needs. this is the tool that you would be documenting that on. And so this would, again, this is a supplementary tool to the SCR. And, you know, given the time, I want to be respectful of the time that we've allotted, but each of these questions will be answered in terms of, you know, the support needs that the team sees and how each of those are being met. And so you'll see a lot of similar language to the HCBS settings assessment, because again, this is a piece that ensures that those aspects are involved in the decision, in this decision. And so I don't know that we necessarily need to go through each of these life domains, because there's, you know, everybody's life looks different and how they're accessing the community and how their social needs will be met, and, you know, all of those different aspects. And this is just a tool for the team to be able to identify those needs and to plan for all of these different areas and life domains and how that will look and how shared living meets that need. So we're addressing, you know, healthy living. Do they have access to everything that they need in that setting to be able to meet their needs, their support needs and goals? Safety and security, you know, how will technology be utilized, or how will they be supported to have autonomy in that safety and security? And then again, especially, you know, when we look at choices, because it has a wide array of services and supports, not just a residential support, how will those other needs, you know, the need for a meaningful day, and will they need to access day service supports or employment supports? So what other resources within choices, but then also within their community, how will those non-residential needs be met? And so that concludes this DD 850. And again, just because I know, you know, sometimes the form will, when it's been updated, we'll have a lot of old forms come in. And so just when you're double checking, you'll just want to make sure that it is the form that has been revised for 4/1/2024. So that was pretty quick, just because, you know, obviously you can kind of read each of these assessments, and the team will be talking about those and identifying it per each individual. But the life domains apply. And so if we can't get to it by the end of this training, it would be helpful to have guidance around how the CSP works with their identified CSS to set up the new setting. And so, yes, generally, we've kind of outlined that through a different process, but essentially the CSP will just communicate in an email to the CSS. If it's a non-family member, that's the shared living provider. They would establish a date and time for that settings assessment to take place. And then once that settings assessment has been completed, then we would kind of internally go through the process of adding that into IRIS. And if it's a family member identified as the shared living provider, then it would consist of an email with the address that's being added, the agency, and identifying whether the shared living provider is a family member or community provider, just so that we can identify that that HCBS settings assessment did not need to occur. Does that answer your question? And you can also touch base with your CSS to determine kind of the specifics of that communication.
Hi, Gus. This is Tammy. I have a couple of things I was just wondering if you could clarify for me.
Yeah.
When you're talking about a new ISP, you're not talking about the family support ISP, is that correct?
No, so that would be within 30 days of starting choices.
Okay.
There would
So
be
that's a different form than what we have. Is that correct?
correct. Yes.
I thought. Okay. And then my other question would be, in the past, a lot of with that application, the coordinators, we have been helping with that. But one of the things that has come about with that is that we were able to bill for that. And the conflict-free case manager is not at that point. Well, how is that going to be able to be changed?
With what specifically? Can you
When we're
repeat?
helping them with the forms, filling out those last forms we just went over?
Oh, the DD 850?
Yeah,
So that's being completed when they're eligible for choices. So the case manager is,
so
that
that'll
is
be
billable
after their, it's
once-
after their start date, it's not before it.
And like I said, in this transition meeting, you know, if you're helping the family kind of gather that information, that's appropriate. It just needs to be communicated during that transition meeting of like, we've completed this form up to this point and you just need, like finalize it. And so, that we certainly encourage like collaboration within the team, but ultimately the case manager is the one that's completing that and submitting it as a part of their choices services. Yes, so the document we just reviewed will be sent out following this meeting, and then it'll also be available on the DHS website.
Gus, it's
Does it
Teresa. Oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
I didn't know if you'd mentioned this, but is there gonna be a listing of all the CSPs who do shared living and the contact info?
Yes,
Okay.
so I've heard back from all the CSS or the CSPs, and then kind of when we put all of the new information onto the website, it will include all 8 providers, the contact person and contact information, and then it will also include like the region or the areas that CSP is supporting shared living families.
Okay, thank you.
I was just wondering, is there ever a time where they're approved for choices moving from family support? That they would not be approved for shared living under choices?
As long as shared living has been identified by the ISP team and it's meeting their residential goals, and that decision is being pursued by the participant, there wouldn't be a reason. Historically we have seen applications come in that say they don't want it yet to pursue it. They didn't sign off on it. And so obviously that it would, if the participant's not wanting that service, same as any services. But no.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so as I said, we'll kind of take these questions and ensure that we have answers to all of them and have a FAQ attached to this. And then you'll see we'll provide the documents that were trained on and shared today. A copy of this video will be available on the provider portal, and you'll also be sent these documents as well. And to kind of just echo the beginning process, just as any of our changes and process changes, we're definitely here to work collaboratively along the way, to hear feedback, to make sure that the process is working. And so don't hesitate to reach out if you've got questions. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you.